Well, hello and welcome to Insight with Political Tours and Beyond the Headlines. Our guest today is Barbara Demick, former LA Times bureau chief in Seoul and Beijing, and the author of two award-winning non-fiction books, Besieged on Bosnia and Nothing to Envy on North Korea. She has a new book out. It's called Eat the Buddha, the story of modern Tibet through the people of one town, and it's what we're going to be discussing for this session of Insight. Hello and welcome, Barbara.
Thanks so much. I'm enjoying being here.
Good. It's a great book. It follows the styles that you've adopted in your two previous books. You follow the lives of various characters that weave through history and tell the story of the region. It's also a tragic story, perhaps for obvious reasons. It's a tale about Tibet. It's also a great opportunity for us to learn some of the history of the region, but also to find out what's happening there today. Thanks very much indeed for this. Let's just start with where you chose to look at. You focused on a particular town. Can you tell us a bit about it and why you chose it?
Sure. The town is, we've been discussing this, called Naba, sometimes pronounced Nawa, sometimes pronounced Aba. Everything is always very complicated with Tibetan. We've been discussing Tibetan versus, Welsh is also quite complicated. Anyway, this town is on the very eastern end of the edge of the Tibetan plateau, so quite close to the center of China. And it's made it sort of a collision point over the years between Tibetans and Chinese. And I've always worked with microcosms. I'd like to take a small town. I did my Sarajevo book is about one street, a group of people, friends, families. It's just easier to do a small place. So I picked this town, which is really kind of a nothing place, but it became world famous about 10 years ago when there was a wave of self-immolations that started in Naba. And, suddenly it was like the self-immolation capital of the world. And so I had to pick a place. So I thought, well, let's pick this one. Let's see, what it is that's made this town so volatile. And I think in that way, I was sort of inspired by a novel written by Orhan Pamuk called Snow, which is about a Turkish town where a lot of young women commit suicide, and that's a novelization. But I was fascinated by this one town.
It's important to say that the book is a sort of crescendo, and the self-immolations. One doesn't want to give the plot away, but we don't know that, and it's sort of we get to that towards the end of the book.
Yeah, and it's not really a book about self-immolation. Yeah. It happens at the end, and actually more about this town. It also had a very rich history, and as I was researching different places in Tibet, this town stood out. It had, like many parts of Tibet, had a local kingdom. And I ran into a woman who was actually the last princess of this particular kingdom. And there were a lot of interesting people and characters and history. And
and the thing that really strikes me about it is that sort of Tibet seems to be overwhelmed by Chinese history and domination. And I think we're all familiar with the sort of key epochs within modern Chinese history, from the Long March, the Great Leap Forward, the Cultural Revolution, and each of these things has a massive impact on Tibet. But what I really like about it is that you explore it through the characters. Can you just talk a bit more about the princess, about Gonpo? Who was this woman? Where did she grow up? And I think that's the sort of almost a starting point, isn't it? Because it's the Tibet of old.
It is. So the book opens in 1958, which is the year that China really cemented its control of this part of Tibet. I should mention, for those of the listeners who know a bit about Tibet, this is after the Chinese invasion of Tibet. It's 9 years after the foundation of the People's Republic of China. But in this part of Eastern Tibet, sort of on the fringes, the Chinese really took over, not legally, but they took over in 1958. So this book opens when this princess, who's 7 years old at the time, is coming home from a family funeral, and she's on horseback, and she sees that her palace is surrounded by little tents, and there's bonfires, and it's the People's Liberation Army has surrounded the palace, and they're evicting the family, the princess and her father, the king, and the rest of this, small nobility, this small noble family. And so it follows, sort of her story as a child being sort of evicted from what was old Tibet. And she goes, it's quite a saga and quite a love story, but she survives this. She goes through the Cultural Revolution. She becomes sort of an elite student in Beijing, and then is like purged and sent to what's essentially the Gulag.
She basically goes straight. Her family are forced into exile, and it's a pretty tragic thing. I mean, basically, her parents, come to an end fairly quickly soon after that, and she sort of grows up in forced exile, but almost in a sort of it's the Siberia of China in a way.
Yeah, well, she's initially kind of assimilated. She's sent to Chinese schools, and she's an excellent student, and becomes kind of Chinese, and forgets her mother tongue. And I don't want to give away too much. Falls in love with a Chinese man, and but her life sort of traces the ups and downs of Tibet and Tibet's relationship with China. And actually a lot of this book is told through the eyes of people who are children at the beginning.
So I wanted to talk about her, and the other character I wanted to talk a bit about was I think it's Pema, who is a market stall, a woman who works at a market stall, and she also has she I mean, can you tell us a bit about her as well, and what she
actually Pema is, I think, my favorite character in a way, and she's like an uneducated woman who works at the market, and she's put into like a forced marriage when she's a teenager to an elderly relative. It's a bit of a saga. And I like her. People who have read my other books will know that there's always somebody like this, somebody who's like uneducated, salt of the earth, working in a market, regular woman, but, just extremely smart about Tibet and China. I mean, you can learn more about Tibet-Chinese relations from somebody like Pema than most professors. And so I really like her, and she also goes through various transformations. At one point, she feels like her life is all the better for being under Chinese rule until it's not.
The thing that strikes when you fairly early on is that China might have been fairly basic back in the 1940s, but Tibet was a whole completely different world. And fairly early on, they recognized that they're not in a position to compete with this sort of overwhelming force in terms of numbers. And it's not until obviously later that China becomes an economic superpower. But if you go back to the 40s and 50s, and even earlier, perhaps a different thing when the Chinese army was hiding out in the 30s during the Long March. But certainly by the 50s, the Tibetans recognized fairly early on that they're no.
You can't fight.
No.
Yeah, maybe I should just mention that incident in the 1930s, because people, I don't want to get ahead of you. People ask, why is this book called Eat the Buddha? As I said, this was the first place where Chinese and Tibetans encountered each other. It was on the east. And during the Long March period, I think the 1930s, I think most of you have some familiarity with Chinese history. This is when the Red Army sort of uprooted from eastern China, and they were fleeing. They were running to get away from the nationalists. This was the beginning of the Chinese Civil War. So the Red Army sort of started fleeing. This was what became known as the Long March. They started fleeing west, 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 and then northwest. And suddenly they were on the Tibetan plateau, and they were like, whoa, where are we? They were at high elevation, and they didn't have any food. They didn't know the language. So they started looting Tibetan homes and monasteries, and among the things they found to eat were these votive statues made of flour and butter. And so it was like symbolically like they were eating the Buddha, and that set the stage for poor relations.
And it's also important to note at that point that they saw this as a foreign land. They didn't see this as being Chinese in any way.
Yes, exactly. And this is something that is not really widely understood about the relationship between Tibet and China. The Tibetans had a relationship in the past with the Qing dynasty. These were Manchus, and most of to the extent that there were administrators in Tibet, they were often Manchus. They spoke Manchurian. They were not Han Chinese. So when these Red Army soldiers, came from southeastern China, they were like, "Are we still in China?" Because Tibet just looks so different. And something that I've always found interesting, I used to travel to this town Naba. I've visited several times, from Chengdu, which is the capital of Sichuan province, panda country, if people have been around there. And you drive up from Chengdu and you go through the mountains and these switchbacks, and it's very, wet and verdant and kind of closed. And then suddenly the sky opens, and it's all like green, and you'll see the snow-capped mountains, and it's like, whoa, you're in a completely different world. When you get to Tibet, you're in Tibet.
Yeah, the reporting of it must have been difficult. I mean, I think we're doing our discussion, we'll touch upon the different periods in history, but just in terms of actually getting to tell the story, can we just talk a little bit about how difficult it is to report on Tibet today?
Sure. Well, I had some privileges. I was the Beijing bureau chief for the LA Times. So I was living in Beijing. I had a press card, I was fully credentialed. So that gave me, some leeway. Something that's a bit complicated to explain is you need a special permit to go into what China calls the Tibet Autonomous Region, which is really Western and Central Tibet. And this Tibet Autonomous Region is really less than half of the Tibetan Plateau and less than half the population. Most of the Tibetan Plateau is in other parts of China, Sichuan, Yunnan, Qinghai, Gansu provinces. So my town, Naba, is in Sichuan. So on paper, it was legal for me as a credentialed correspondent in China to travel there without a special permit, and sometimes, I'd call to say, am I allowed to go here? Yes, I was. But what you're on paper allowed to do and what you're actually allowed to do are very different. And this town was always sort of, a center of Tibetan discontent. And you'd get there and there'd be a checkpoint and they'd turn back journalists and foreigners and, anybody who was not Chinese. So it was actually quite difficult to get into the town. I often traveled in the back of taxis wearing kind of a big hat and a face mask. I mean, pre-COVID, a lot of Chinese wore face masks in this area just for protection against the dust and the sun. And so it was very common to have the same kind of masks, cloth masks people are wearing now. And, I'd wear a big hat and, I used different methods. Sometimes I went by bus, but usually I went in the back of a car.
And the difficulty also is that for the people you're speaking to, it's very dangerous also.
Exactly. There's really very low tolerance for the Tibetans talking to journalists, even if it's about something innocuous, even if you're, doing a story about how you raise yak or making yak milk cheese. They don't want Tibetans talking to journalists. So that was very difficult. And after a few kind of dicey trips, I started traveling with a Chinese driver rather than a Tibetan driver, because I just didn't want to get a Tibetan in trouble. And it was quite, I speak some Chinese, not great Chinese. Sometimes I traveled with a Chinese assistant, but it was really kind of impossible to travel with a Tibetan translator because they'd get into too much trouble.
Is there a moment in the book where you're, it's not in Naba, but it's in another area where you are speaking to some people? I think it's quite late in the night, or for some reason you don't have transport. Am I confusing things?
Yeah, I know. This was a couple of hours outside of Naba. I was with a Tibetan friend. This was one of my early trips, and we were talking to somebody, and it ended up being like 5:30, and we were traveling by public transport then. Last time I did that, and we didn't have a car, and there's no buses there. We were just out on the plateau. So my friend said, "Oh well, let's just like hitchhike back to town." So we put out our thumbs, and we saw a car in the distance, and we're waving, and then the car came closer, and we could see that it was police. There's something called the armed police. We could tell by the license plate that it was police, and we couldn't like run off and hide because it was just like open plateau. There was, basically featureless. But it was fortunately, somewhat getting somewhat dark. So my friend, who was Tibetan, got in the front seat, and I got in the back seat.
So you're hitching a lift in a police car?
Yeah, so we were hitching a lift. It didn't have the sirens on top, but it was, it was police. And I had my hat, and I don't know if I was wearing a mask, but I had my hat and my head down. And my friend, they asked about, the girl in the back seat. My friend said, "Oh, she doesn't speak Chinese."
Doesn't speak Chinese. Yeah.
Yeah. I was like kind of the report.
The important point was that it might have been tricky for you, but it'd been worse for your friend, wouldn't it?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
exactly. And
I think it's worth reminding people that the sort of the waves of history and what impact they had on Tibet, broader Tibet, not just the autonomous region. Mao Zedong takes the decision that Tibet is going to become part of China. There's something called the 17-point agreement that it effectively coerces Tibet to become part of China, but gives it some kind of autonomy. And that doesn't work out. And in 1959, you have great big revolts across Tibet.
Yeah, and the timeline is slightly different in this area, because this part of Tibet was not covered by the 17-point agreement. Again, it was in Eastern Tibet. And in theory, it had been part of China since the late 18th century, but not really. It was, these were maps and stuff, but these were, self-governing Tibetan areas under, different kings and local rulers. And as I said, the Chinese really moved in 1958. It was the year before the revolt in 1959. And what happened is that Tibetans from this area of Eastern Tibet, went fleeing to Lhasa, seeking the protection of the Dalai Lama. And that instability was what led to his flight to India. So things here happened a bit before they did in central Tibet. And, what was very interesting to me is that so many of these stories are unknown. Most Tibetans who you'll meet in London or, certainly in New York, we have a lot of Tibetans in New York where I am, are from this part of Eastern Tibet. It's the more populous part of Tibet. But their stories and their history are really quite unknown.
Yeah. And so the book starts almost with this kingdom that essentially folds under Chinese dominance. There's the Cultural Revolution that has an enormous impact on the region. There are Red Brigades that are sort of rebellious, seeing this as a moment for sort of almost for Tibetan independence in some form or other. that's put down by the People's Liberation Army. And then you almost get into a period in the 1980s where things calm down, and there's a sort of belief that the Tibetans will get the rights that they seek, but things really begin to tighten up again. And by the time you're a correspondent, things have got very difficult. Can you just give us a sort of an evolution from the 90s to the current day? What's happened during that period?
Well, I'm just going to go back briefly to 1958 when things started, because that was really the apocalypse for Tibetans in this area. And it was then that they were herded into communes, their animals and land were taken away. There was mass starvation. Anywhere between 10-20% of the Tibetan population died. In that period, people were thrown into pits, they were shot. I mean, it was just a complete disaster. And the Tibetans use the term, they say 1958, the way we say 911, that date, it's the disaster, it's the Nakba, whatever term you want to use. And then after that, there were, waves of uprisings, as you said, during the real Cultural Revolution period. Actually, some of the Tibetans kind of rose up and tried to get more independence. In 1976, Mao died, and after Mao's death, things just vastly improved. It was the end of the Cultural Revolution, the end of the, some of the, the forced collectivization. And in the 80s, it was kind of the golden era for Tibetans and also for Chinese. Under Hu Yaobang, who was the most tolerant Chinese leader, he was the first Chinese leader to, sort of apologize to the Tibetans and say, like, things were not, were not great in the 50s and 60s. I mean, really, they destroyed most of the monasteries. They forced out most of the monks and nuns. And, this was also, I'll say it was a very rough period for Han Chinese as well. But everything that was done to the Chinese was done 10 times over to the Tibetans. It was always much worse. And so this was a fairly tolerant period for Tibetans. They reopened schools and started studying their own language again. There was businesses started, and it began to turn downwards, I guess, after Tiananmen Square in 1989. You got, a wave of repression coming in. And
at the same time, a huge economic expansion, which Tibet is obviously, the development of China means there are people and businesses that come with it that dominates Tibet at the same time, or dominates this area at the same time.
Exactly. And then, leading up to the Beijing Summer Olympics in 2008, there was a big economic push. The railroad to Lhasa was opened a few years before, and there was just a lot of development. But with the development came more repression and more control of the monasteries, more control of the language, more checkpoints. Tibetans really couldn't travel around China. They sometimes couldn't go to a hospital in the next township without a permit. Chinese could just go sailing through the checkpoints, but the Tibetans couldn't, and they were just felt more controlled. Their religion was controlled, their language was controlled, and that led to really kind of an explosion of protests right before the Olympics in March 2008. And Naba, the town I'm writing about, had the biggest protests outside of Lhasa. And it was after those protests, in the aftermath of the protests, that people started burning themselves. And it was very interesting because it was sort of an extension of Tibetan ideas about nonviolence. These people wanted to make, a powerful statement about their displeasure under Chinese rule, but they didn't want to hurt anybody else, so they killed themselves. And it was, very, very, very much entailed with these like teachings about nonviolence.
Yeah. I think there's a bit of disturbance. I don't know whether it's a mouse or your mouse or something, but there's a bit of disturbance with the microphone. Something maybe to do with the keyboard, which we're picking up on a bit. So just
okay, I'll try to sit closer.
That's okay. So the one of the book reaches a crescendo with the self-immolations, and that's really from 2009 onwards. And one of the fascinating things I saw and you talk about is the link between those people and the revolts of the past. The people generally, that it seems as though the people who are making these protests, are linked to families who have had a strong political involvement previously.
That's right. That's right. And it keeps on coming back. There's a lot of research now into what they call epigenetics. It's, the sort of perpetuation of trauma between generations, whether they're Holocaust survivors or descendants of slaves, or any group of people that has been through a trauma. And that's been very true of the Tibetans. They went through this enormous struggle in the 1950s. I mean, really every Tibetan family lost a lot of relatives. There was nobody who was untouched. They died of famine, they were shot, died in prison. And then in subsequent years, the Tibetans of the sort of middle generation tried to cover it up. They didn't want to talk about it. They felt like, why dwell on that anger? But the younger generation kind of, picked it up. They had heard some of these stories that had been, sort of whispered by their grandparents. So many of the people who self-immolated came from families that had political prisoners, had a lot of people killed. These were the descendants of freedom fighters. And I think it's one of the reasons that this part of Tibet, sort of became the engine of the resistance.
Okay. It's a great book. And I do, it's only recently out, so I think very few of you will have read it thus far, but do get your hands on it. Please start putting your questions in the Q&A box, and so you can put your questions directly to Barbara. Barbara, you covered Beijing. What time when you the bureau chief, what time, and also in Seoul as well. So when were you covering the region?
I was in China from 2007 to 2014.
Yeah, okay. And you make conclusions towards the end. You talk about China's relationship with its minorities. And I think one of the things that I'm interested to ask is we see what's happening in Hong Kong. Last week, we had a discussion about Taiwan and Xi Jinping's ambitions to absorb Taiwan within the time that he's in office. And then we look at what's happening in Xinjiang. Is there any possibility of sort of Han Chinese dominated China allowing different minorities to have autonomy or some expression of independence, independent culture, language? I mean, how do you see that developing? It's a very bleak outlook if you read the conclusion of your book.
I mean, it is not a very tolerant period in China, and I see Xi Jinping, wanting to, exert absolute control over all the peripheral parts of the empire, Xinjiang in the Northwest, Hong Kong, Tibet. I think Tibet was the original basically one nation, two systems. As you mentioned, there was an agreement that they could have autonomy, and it just, it collapsed very quickly. In the long term, I'm not so pessimistic because, Xi Jinping will probably seek another term, but China goes through these, these oscillations of crackdowns and liberalization. And Tibetan culture is quite resilient. I mean, people think of Tibet as, this kind of this minority region, but Tibet is a major civilization. It's a major language. There's a huge literature in Tibetan, not just about Buddhism, but medicine, astronomy. There's poetry. There's a lot of Tibetan literature, and there's also, in China, there's a lot of interest in Tibetan Buddhism. There's a lot of Tibetan Buddhists. And I was in Lhasa 3 years ago, and it was just like filled with young Chinese tourists who were, kind of seeking something. There's been a lot said about, China. The Chinese have lost their soul as they've gotten rich. They don't believe in anything. And that this is something that Chinese people talk about a lot. And I think many of them feel like that missing soul is somewhere in Tibet. So, I'm sort of hopeful that, under another government or another time, there might be a little bit more leeway. The Tibetans have sort of, whittled down their demands.
That doesn't come through in the book. And you travel to Dharamsala, which is where the Tibetan government in exile is based, and you meet the Dalai Lama. And the Dalai Lama is sort of incredibly optimistic about the chances, but at the same time, it's clear to you, it seems, that he is trying to essentially save Tibetan culture. It's no longer about the nation, it's about the identity and culture of the people.
Yeah, and you see that, I think I mentioned this in the book too, he meets very often with Jewish leaders. And in fact, there's a quote in there from Elie Wiesel, who says the Dalai Lama asked him, how did your people survive? How do they keep their identity intact in 2,000 years in exile?
That's pretty bleak, isn't it? I mean, the second temple has fallen, effectively in Lhasa. They've gone into exile, and they've got another 2,000 years to wait.
Yeah. It's Xi Jinping's, mother was a Buddhist, and it's a very interesting. Xi Jinping's father also who was an early Chinese leader and a comrade of Mao's, met the Dalai Lama, and throughout his life wore a watch that the Dalai Lama had given him as a young man. I think he wore that watch almost to his death. Yeah. So there's a strange, affection for the Tibetans among some Chinese.
An odd way of showing it at the moment.
Well, it's not as bleak as Xinjiang. I don't think they have any affection for the Uyghurs, but they do for the Tibetans. So
how do you explain that? So why is Xinjiang so? Why does there seem to be such a repressive regime there, and perhaps at least some tolerance nominally? You've got the temples. There's people are allowed to worship at least.
The Tibetans have more in the way of advocates overseas. There's a lot of Westerners who are interested in Tibet. And the Uyghurs are Muslims, which has made them unpopular in some quarters. The US at one point, agreed with the Chinese that some of the Uyghur independence groups could be designated as terror groups. And I mean, there was actual terrorism. Not a lot, but there was. I mean, I covered some of these incidents. There was a Uyghur family that mowed down some tourists at Tiananmen Square. I visited a Filipina in the hospital. After that, there were some major knife attacks at train stations in China. So I think they were, the Chinese have been more worried about the Uyghurs and felt that they were getting support from across the border from Afghanistan and some of the stands. The Tibetans have more support from the outside world, but they don't have borders. They don't have weapons, and they don't have as much of a history of violent resistance. They have some.
And perhaps depressingly, when you visit Dharamsala, there are many people who think, well, I've heard from my family, back in Naba, there's a lot of development going on, they're okay. And really, I haven't got much future here in India. Maybe I'd be better off back there.
Yeah, and this is a point that I've tried to make, that the Tibetans are really not. The issue is not the economy with the Tibetans. The economy in Tibetan areas lags way behind Han Chinese areas. I mean, even on the Tibetan plateau, you see beautiful housing being built for Chinese and really crap shoeboxes for the Tibetans. But that isn't the issue. I mean, most of the Tibetans I met, felt that the economy had improved under Chinese rule, at least, since the 80s. But they want, they want some of their freedoms, not in the way of Western democracy, but some of the same freedoms that are given to Han Chinese, such as they are. For example, Tibetans, by and large, can't get passports. It's very difficult for them to travel internally. Most parts of the plateau, they can't have pictures of the Dalai Lama, who's their spiritual leader. Some places you can, some you can't. There's new restrictions every year on the study of the Tibetan language, and they face a lot of job discrimination. I quote in the last chapter of the book, a man I know from Naba who's an entrepreneur, quite well off. He has a couple of very nice cars and a couple of very nice condos. And he said, I have everything I want in life except my freedom. And they see, the Chinese partaking in what Xi Jinping calls the Chinese dream. And they're like, okay, if we're going to accept Chinese rule, let us be treated like other Chinese.
Yeah. And normally, I'm just trying to think of my experience in, former Yugoslavia. If you were from a marginal, if you're from former Yugoslavia, and let's say if you were Albanian, you would never be able to get a job within the civil service because you weren't, you weren't a Serb essentially. Within Naba, you couldn't hope to get a job within the civil service because you're not Han Chinese, you're a Tibetan, and you're going to be.
No, that's not. That's actually, it's a little bit different than the former Yugoslavia. They can get jobs in the civil service, but if you get a job in the civil service, you have to really give up a lot of your identity. You're not supposed to practice religion at all as a civil servant. And, if you're a teacher, even if you're a teacher or a bus driver or working for a state-owned company, there's a lot of very strict rules for civil servants. And, the Chinese government does recruit Tibetans, especially for the police and, some of the infrastructure, well, not the construction work, but for the police and, the bureaucracy. But they're much more tightly controlled than other Tibetans.
And if you want to be a successful businessman, if you want to go into commerce, what are your prospects then?
Well, you just face a lot of discrimination. Like Naba used to be famous for its traders. I mean, it's south of the Silk Road, but they used to trade, salt and animal skins and tea through Naba, going from sort of the eastern part of China into Nepal and India. But Tibetans now can't get passports, so they can't trade. And when there's like a plot of land to be developed, those contracts are always given to Han Chinese businesses. It's very difficult for Tibetans to compete.
Yeah.
And there's all sorts of impediments. Like it's still not unusual to see ads that specify Han only.
Because you could then make the argument that, okay, look, my life under the Chinese government is fantastic now. It's dramatically better than it used to be. And also, we're as well off as any other Chinese citizen is, but it's clearly not the case.
No, and it's as I said, the difference between the Tibetan areas and the Chinese areas is just really striking. I stayed for a bit in a village not far from Naba, and this was the area where I was hitchhiking, and there was no running water, there was no school, there's no very little electricity, no street lights. There was like one public toilet that was just like a box without a top. All there was police. It's just like security.
And the numbers of police, I mean, I think there's 50,000 people stationed outside Naba with a population of what?
Yeah, about 60,000.
60,000 people, yeah. So
yeah, no, there's just crazy amounts of security in that area. And then you go, to one of the new developments being built for Chinese investors, and you see, beautiful townhouses with little balconies and peaked roofs and, space for gardens, and, clearly going to be a very nice townhouse complex.
And would a Tibetan be able to buy a house in that, was a flat in that kind of apartment block?
I suspect not. I haven't seen anybody try. I think it would be, maybe there'd be a few party members, but I think there would be various impediments, not so much in the law, but unspoken, in terms of getting a loan or even hearing about it. These things will be marketed to Chinese investors, and, you'll see in the marketing literature is only in Chinese.
Yeah, okay. Do ask questions, everyone. I'm looking for questions in the Q&A box here, just to the on the right-hand side of your screen. So just there, please, everyone. I'm going to turn to your other book, the previous book here, which I have a copy of here, which I got 3 for 2 at Waterstones. This book had a tremendous success. How many copies did you sell of this, Barbara? Have you sold worldwide? Do you know?
I don't know offhand. I think close to 1 million.
Just a million.
Maybe more. I checked a few years ago.
Yeah.
It sold very well in the UK, also in Taiwan. It was very popular in China. It was not published in mainland China, but the Taiwan edition sold very well in Hong Kong and also Taiwan.
Yeah. You did the same principle. You followed some key characters. I can't remember, 5 or 6 characters in
6 people.
6 people in the book.
Yeah.
And there was I think a lot of people who are watching this have read it, and there was a tragic story of 2 people who were in love with each other, and they both escaped from North Korea. Well, perhaps I shouldn't give away the story, but it didn't end entirely happily ever after. Have you been back? Have you followed up on some of the stories in that book? You must get questions about that.
I do follow up. I mean, I haven't been back to North Korea since that book came out. I felt like it would be too. I have not.
You've not.
But I see the people in my book are for the most part living in South Korea, and I do see them relatively often. I mean, this year I haven't been traveling, but I saw both the young man and the young woman, who are now the middle-aged man and the middle-aged woman, about a year ago in Seoul. And, I do keep in touch with these people.
Yeah, I've got more questions about that book. And I think in the kind of people fleeing North Korea since that period has now changed. And that's something which I find very, very interesting. And it says something about what's going on at the moment. But let's bring in some questions. Diane Cook has got a question about the current book and also about Tibet. Diane, go ahead.
Yeah, just as you right at the end of what you were saying about Tibet, Barbara, what degree of intermarriage or relationships are there between the Han Chinese and the Tibetans?
There's actually a lot of intermarriage, much more than between the Han Chinese and the Uyghurs. And it doesn't seem to be such a big deal. In fact, several of the people in my book are married, Tibetans are married to Chinese. The princess who we were talking about, her husband is Chinese, and the businessman who I mentioned, his wife is Chinese. it's interesting. I don't feel like it's the same kind of ethnic conflict like some others I've covered. I worked in the Balkans. Obviously some Tibetans hate Chinese, some Chinese hate Tibetans, but not as much as you might think. There's historic conflicts in that area between Buddhists and Muslims that goes back many years. But between the Chinese and the Tibetans, it's not so much. And there's a famous story about how a Tibetan king married a Chinese princess and this Chinese princess helped to bring Buddhism to Tibet. So it's not discouraged, but it's not forced. In the case of the Uyghurs, there's been really pressure on Uyghurs to marry outside the faith in order to assimilate. I haven't seen that kind of pressure applied to Tibetans, but the intermarriage doesn't seem to be that big a deal.
Right. Okay, Louise Tarrant has got a question, so we'll bring Louise up in just a second. Speaking, it would seem to me that one of the key issues is that the Dalai Lama has got such a presence among Tibetans that competing sense of authority is too much for the Communist Party to accept. And one of the points that you make in your book is that there's this desire for the Communist Party, as soon as the Dalai Lama's dead, they're going to make damn sure that they're going to be finding who the next one is. Yeah,
exactly. I mean, I think that's their phobia about the Dalai Lama. We used to always, joke that the Dalai Lama was kind of like their Voldemort, he whose name cannot be mentioned. You can't. We would refer to the DL or the HHDL, His Holiness the Dalai Lama. You just couldn't even say his name. And I think it's exactly that. It's a competing source of authority.
Yeah, and it's a very powerful one. Yuri, it's not Louise Tarrant. Louise is disguised with a beard and a moustache, and that beard is Yuri. Hello, Yuri.
Sorry to disappoint, Nicholas. My question really related to the relationship with Tibetans to the Communist Party and whether or not they do join the Communist Party, whether there's a Tibetan branch of the Communist Party and whether they can initiate a debate on the party policy about Tibet within the party.
That's a really good question, actually.
Yes. And, there are many Tibetans who become party members. And if they want to rise in the civil service, as we were discussing, they have to become a party member. And there's a lot of pressure on them to become a party member. And then, this becomes the issue. Once you become a party member, you face new restrictions on worship. The Chinese are not saying if you have like somebody who's herding yaks, nobody's going to tell him that he can't go to the monastery. But if you become a party member, you cannot go to the monastery. There's closed circuit cameras at all the monasteries. And, you're not supposed to do the circumambulation or celebrate the holidays. And I don't think this is completely unique to Tibetans, but it's a big factor in Tibet is like religion and culture are completely inseparable. The Tibetans, especially the older people, will circumambulate the monasteries doing the Kora, and they'll prostrate themselves. And it's sort of religious, but it's sort of exercise and it's sort of social. Everything in their culture is tied up with Tibetan Buddhism. So being told that you can't practice religion is a big deal. It's like do you join the Communist Party and you can't have a Christmas tree or.
And Barbara, would people change their names? Would they try and adopt a Han Chinese name and to try and push their Tibetan identity aside if they want to get ahead?
Not exactly, but they'll often have, sinicized names so that they can, put them in Chinese characters. So the names aren't really changed, but they'll have a Tibetan name and a Chinese name. Right. And if they're, an intellectual, maybe an English name too.
Yuri, you follow up?
There's nothing. Then my question really was that, you know, there is not networking arrangements among Tibetan members of the party in some form of social cohesion among them that they can influence the party. But I think what you're saying, that's just not possible.
Well, there are senior, some of the officials in Tibet are members of the party, and I'm sure they have some interactions with each other, but I don't know that they've been able to influence the overall direction of the party. But, there were a lot of Tibetans, especially in the 40s and 50s, even the 30s, who embraced the Communist Party. Among them, the Dalai Lama, who was very, he said this to me in interviews, and he said it to other interviewers, that he was very taken with the precepts of socialism, not so much the Communist Party, not the anti-religion part, but the sharing of wealth and the elimination of old hierarchies, and there's a
like the Soviet Union. Is there a Tibetan Communist Party? If you look, the Soviet Union used to have different there was the Estonian bloc, there was the there were different Soviets. So is there a Tibetan equivalent of that?
Yeah, I mean, there's the general secretary of the Communist Party of Tibet, who is Chinese, but there are other officials who are Tibetan. And there may be smaller social clubs, but there are a lot of Tibetans in the party. A lot of the police
and the prefects who hold the governors who hold huge powers and who have the policing powers. They're all Han Chinese.
There are some Tibetans in positions of power. And I think they're like, this is true of many Han Chinese as well. They join the party because they want to get ahead. They're not necessarily true believers, but as I said, there's this natural affinity between socialism and Tibetan Buddhism. Sort of the abrogation of the self, some of the ideas about giving away wealth. So there were a lot of early, before things turned bad, going into the 30s and 40s, you'll see a lot of Tibetans who embraced socialism.
Yeah. Okay. Sheila de Blake, you've got a question. Sheila.
I wanted to ask about education. What kind of education do Tibetan children get, and do they go to the same schools as their Chinese neighbors?
Generally not. It varies from town to town, but most of the education now is in Chinese, and they seem to be in separate schools. I know that there are some that are mixed in Naba, but the schools that I've visited have been pretty much either Chinese or Tibetan.
And did you say in Naba, but the last primary school that was teaching in Tibetan has just dropped that as the
it's switching to Tibetan as a second language, so that they'll still teach Tibetan, but they'll teach it the way they would be teaching English or some other foreign language. The primary language of instruction is in Chinese, and some of the schools are really very poor. I have an incident that I talk about in the book where I went to a Tibetan school near Naba, not in Naba, but I walked in I was just like wandering around with a photographer, and we walked into a classroom, and there were like, maybe 35 kids, little kids, like, 6, 7 years old, and no teacher. Absolutely no teacher. And one of the kids had a nose. And so when we walked in, the kids were really excited. It's like, oh, teachers have come. They kind of like bowed, and they were trying to tell us that one of the kids had a nosebleed, and we're like, we're journalists here. And we went back to the photographer I was working with had gone to that school in the morning, and we went back also in the afternoon, and there was no teacher there. And Tibetan parents have told me their kids, go to these schools and there's no teacher, and they like come out and they can't write their name and don't learn anything. And this has been the issue, with the monasteries. The monasteries, have been the schools. Kids go to the monasteries basically to get an education. And it was traditional for Tibetan families to send at least one boy to the monastery. And in part, it was to learn how to read and write. And until maybe 15 years ago, some of these monastery schools were very good. The Dalai Lama had this big campaign to like modernize the schools. And some of those monastery schools were teaching math and science and Chinese.
Those monasteries are huge. The one outside Naba has got 3,000 monks in it. That's enormous, isn't it?
They're huge. And they're like, as I said, they're like, a college campus in a way. There's, there are libraries and art studios, and the monasteries are, and the nunneries to some extent, a lesser extent, it filled the gap where the schools fell down.
Yeah, but the expectation is that if you give your child away, if your child goes to join the monastery, that's it. They are a monk for life. There's some people.
No, not at all. Not at all. Not. And it's a lot of those monks, turn, 16, 17 and say, celibacy, no alcohol, forget it.
But they're dropping out at that point. The expectation they should continue.
But it's not a disgrace to drop out. It's expected that a certain number of them, and they're actually novice monks, and they'll say, okay, I've got enough education, and now I'll go back to run the family business or do something else.
Barbara, can you describe what it's like to go to Naba today? You'd see the monastery, you'd see Tibetan murals with Tibetan writing on them, but you'd also see a very, very heavy police presence as well, wouldn't you?
Yeah, and this has been a big issue, that there have been police and various security forces in the monasteries. It's part of what caused the uprising in 2008 and after that. And monks were sometimes forced to sign loyalty oaths, sort of denouncing the Dalai Lama, which is really unthinkable for a Tibetan. And it there's been this cycle of resistance and crackdowns, and sometimes the police presence is really counterproductive.
And it might depend upon the individual at the top. I gather there was a prefect or a governor who's particularly hard line, and he's moved to Xinjiang province. It was his thinking that has been behind the internment or prison camps in Xinjiang.
Yeah. It's things in China are much more regionalized than people realize, and even especially in Tibet, people say, well, or they're always sending me notes saying, like, I went to Yunnan province and I saw plenty of photographs of the Dalai Lama, and Yunnan province is, not so controlled. Other places you can't, have even a tiny picture on your body. You'll be searched, you can be thrown in prison, but other places it's normal. So it depends a lot on the leadership of that area.
Yeah, okay. We've got a couple of minutes, we just need to sort of wrap up now. You talked about some sort of optimism. Do you see any short-term sign of that? I mean, Xi Jinping just doesn't seem to be the guy who's going to allow Tibetans to have more religious freedom and general freedom of expression in general.
I mean, I don't see much in the short term, but I will say that things are much better in Tibet than Xinjiang. They have not had the same kind of massive internments. There's been some talk of these work study programs where Tibetans are being sort of channeled into programs designed to send them to other parts of China and assimilate them, but it's not been as bad as Xinjiang.
Okay. Every book you've written so far has won numerous amounts of awards, and I think this is going to follow suit. My last question is, what have you got your eyes on next? What are you going to turn your hand to next?
Well, I'm actually writing something now about adopted Chinese girls. But there was something else I wanted to say, you know, about this book. I mean, I really tried to do a lot the same that I did with North Korea, you know, take a place that people don't really understand and make it accessible. And when I was, you know, starting to write about Tibet, people would say, what are you writing about? And I'd say Tibet. And then I'd get kind of like a blank and then some embarrassment because people were like, I ought to know more about Tibet, but I don't. And they didn't know what to ask me. And so, you know, the idea was to make it, you know, make Tibet accessible. Yeah. And, you know, these books are written for sort of, you know, I came out of a newspaper writing tradition. I didn't work for the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal. So it's, you know, designed to be accessible to a, you know, sort of a mainstream reader. And so the next book is a little bit different because it's first person, but it's about my experiences with some Chinese adoptees.
Wow. Okay. I'm looking forward to that. I've got to say, I do think that you could produce a sequel to this, following up on the lives of the people you spoke about. But also, I think there's another generation of refugees coming out of North Korea, and North Korea is always, you know, changing, although static in other ways. So
yeah, I'm thinking after this next book that I'll go back to North Korea. I don't know that I would write about the people in my book because they're you know, they're living in South Korea now. I'm not really interested in. Yeah. I'm not as interested in them, but there's the people inside North Korea. The situation has changed a lot. I'm really interested in North Korea as this unplugged country that has tried to like stay off of the internet and, you know, tried to keep itself, you know, completely isolated. And,
and as part of this series, we've interviewed, and also on our travels, we've met a wide range of refugees or defectors from North Korea, and one's really struck by the entrepreneurship of some of them and how ingenious they are and how they've managed to survive. Particularly some of the more recent refugees. I mean, their cases vary from significantly. Barbara, thank you very much indeed. It's been really, really enjoyable talking to you. My thanks to Barbara Demick. Her book is out now. It is called Eat the Buddha, and that is all available at all independent bookshops.